Hello everyone and welcome back to the video. Today we're going to be talking about trash units in Age of Empires 2 and which trash unit is the best in the game. Trash unit, if you guys aren't familiar with the term, simply means a unit that costs no gold. So only food and wood. In this video, we're not going to be considering civ-specific trash units like melee 200 swordsmen or janitors. We're going to be only considering the generic lines of trash units, the Skirmisher line, the Spearman line, and the Hussar line. It's important to talk about trash units because gold doesn't last forever in your average game of 1v1 Arabia or any other 1v1 map. Gold tends to run out quite quickly and you're going to be left with a lot of food and wood to fend for yourself. It doesn't mean you have zero gold access in late game. There are relics in the market, as well as you're able to keep your gold army alive in a lot of cases, so keep that in mind. Alright, so back to the three lines of trash units. All three lines have their pros and cons, and there's a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors effect that happens between them, so let's talk about it all, as well as the cost associated to each of the units. The Skirmisher costs 35 wood and 25 food. It does really well into backline gold units like Arbalest and heavy cav archers, but it dies really hard to any frontline unit like the Hussar. It does okay against halbs because they're able to kill them at bay with their attack bonus, but if the halbs close the distance, the halbs have pretty decent damage, and the Skirm has very squishy stats, no melee armor base, and only 35 HP. The halberdier now, it does pretty much the opposite. It has a high attack bonus against cavalry units, so it does really well against Hussars, Paladin, and Elephants, but it dies hard to Arbalest, heavy cav archer, and Skirmishers at a distance, and as I said earlier, if the halbs can close the distance, they can do really well into the Skirmishers. Both of these units die to champions, but champions aren't very viable in most late games, and I'll tell you why. Alright, the third unit is unlike the other two. The Hussar has no attack bonus except versus the monk, and so you have to rely on other things to make this unit work. It has actually a pretty well balanced kit. It has medium attack, medium health, and medium armor. Like, it has good pierce armor, pretty bad medium armor, but the things that it excels in is raiding and high mobility. High mobility is an amazing positive. It's an amazing pro for this unit, and it makes it the fastest unit in most 1v1 Arabia games. And when we're not considering any naval units or anything like that, Hussar will be the fastest unit on the map, much faster than any unit on foot, and even a bit faster than heavy cav archers and paladins. So that value alone gives it quite a lot of potential. But it also trades really well because of its well-balanced stats and low cost at only 80 food, against Cavalier, against Tarkans, against infantry like champions. It does really well against Skirmishers, and it even does pretty well against Arbalest and heavy cav archer, assuming it's not a big ball of those units. So as you can see, it does pretty well against most things. It only hard dies to like Paladin, Elephants, and Halberdiers. So if you take a look at a general composition for a late game, you usually have one gold unit, one food unit, and one siege unit. If you've watched any of my guides, this is what I recommend, and watch any pro game. In like 90% of cases, you'll be finding this composition being used. The reason this composition is super effective is because trash units really work well at soaking up a lot of damage and having a nice counter damage to target a specific gold unit that your opponent has, and it doesn't have gold cost attached to this trash units. You're able to play pretty aggressive with it in most cases, and you don't care if they die. They also work really well at defending your siege and pushing your opponent's siege as well, because again, siege is high gold cost, so attacking your opponent's siege with trash units is a really good option, because if you kill that siege, it's usually a good trade. You're trying to trade food and wood versus your opponent's gold in most cases. A general composition, there's like basically two options that you can have: a gold backline and a trash meat shield, or a gold front line and a trash back line. Now, right off the bat, I can tell you that the setup of having the gold unit in the back is much better. And I can give you countless examples of this in real game situations, but I'll just let you guys think about it real quick. If you have the gold unit in the back, it's so easy to defend this gold unit because you can keep it near your siege at the back or near your castles, and it's very hard for your opponent to jump in and engage on that gold unit army when you have the trash unit in front. Let's play out the scenario. It's Arbalest and Hussar versus Paladin and Skirmisher. Now, obviously, Arbalest don't shred Paladins, but they do decent DPS against them, and over time they will take care of the Paladins. The Skirmishers do really well against Arbalest, but they have to come up close for that to be the case. You have to actually be able to attack the Arbalest. The Hussars do really well into the Skirmishers and can easily tank a few hits from the Paladin as well. So in a general fight between these two compositions, what will happen is this: the Arbalest will patrol, the Paladin will run in, Hussars will tank the damage of the Paladin, and a few Hussars will break the lines of the Skirmishers, preventing them from coming too close. The Skirmishers will snipe a few Arbalest, and a few Paladin will go down as well. Once all the Hussars die, the Arbalest player can easily retreat and use the reinforcing Hussars to prevent the Paladin from running in. The Paladin player will be left with a lot of his units dying, and a lot of his Skirmishers still alive, but those are quite useless because, again, they are trash units and they're easy to replace, but the Paladin are hard to replace, and then the ball of Arbalest will pretty much never die in its entirety. You'll lose a few every fight, but it's not near under the cost of what the few Paladin going down are. This is not to mention what raiding would look like in this composition. Hussar can easily raid, whereas the Paladin player can't really raid back, and I'll tell you why. Hussar's raiding is super effective. For only 80 food, you can easily get a lot of raids done, and if they die, you don't care, you just remake them. For the Paladin, 60 food and 75 gold, and while it is a stronger unit than the Hussar, first of all, it doesn't move as fast, so it's not as easy to get it in the back line. That little bit of movement speed for the Hussar matters a lot, and if you lose it, you lose a lot of that gold, so it's suddenly not the best trade to be trading your Paladin for some raids. It's obviously good in certain cases if you get a lot of villagers, but in the case where you get only 1 or 2 villagers with 1 Paladin, it's really not a good trade, because you're trading against 100 food plus that walking time that the villagers take to get to their work, and you're trading 60 food and 75 gold. It's simply not effective. Hussar, on the other hand, only has to kill literally 1 villager for it to be a worth it trade. 80 food compared to 50 food plus the walking time of that villager, that's a pretty good deal. So 1 Hussar versus 1 villager in late game is a good trade in almost all cases. Let's take that to a higher scale, 20 Hussars versus 20 villagers, and you're looking at a game-ending raid. Those 20 villagers are going to be really hard to replace because generally speaking, you only have 3 or 4 town centers in late game, whereas you can have up to like 20 stables, no problem. So you can remake those 20 Hussars in simply 30 seconds, and it will take your opponent minutes to make those villagers back. It's also super hard to make sure the villagers that are being made are also going right away to work and pick up where you left off to keep your economy flowing. So as you can see, the rating value that the Hussar gets is simply off the charts, whereas the Paladin doesn't have that luxury, because if you're losing gold to get that same value, you will run out of gold much faster than you'll run out of the food cost, and the Paladin also, once again, doesn't move as fast, so can't get as effective raids as the Hussar can, despite having higher attack and better stats. As you can see in this situation, the Hussar and backline gold units will pretty much always win if played correctly, and it's going to be really hard and pretty much impossible in the late game for the Paladin Skirm player to win, again, if played correctly. The Paladin Skirm player can only win if they get a nice tempo lead, or if they land that super good fight where they're able to wipe out the Arbalest army, or if they rely on some siege to pick off the Arbalest in the back. Alright, the other composition to talk about is, let's say we have a backline gold unit for both sides, let's say Arbalest or Heavy Cav Archer, and the front line will be either Halbs or Hussars. We did say Halbs counter Hussars, so if your opponent goes Hussars, why not I go Halbs? Well, as I said earlier, Halbs hard die to the backline gold units. So if it's Arbalest and Hussar versus Arbalest and Halbs, the Halbs would easily die to the Arbalest, and then once the Halbs get thinned out, the Hussar can easily run in and clean up the Arbalest in the back. As you can see, you're not forced to actually take this fight in the first place, because the Hussar can simply raid around the map non-stop with their high mobility, and only fight when your opponent has their Halbs all over the place chasing your raids. You bring the Hussar back to the front, and you can easily attack your opponent when they have only a few Halbs defending their Arbalest. It sounds super easy to do in theory, although it's quite hard to do in practice, so it does take a lot of practice. But once you get there, the Hussar just gives you a ton of value in late game, and you're able to make these plays happen and consistently take better fights than your opponent can if they're not making the Hussar. So you might be thinking, what is the counter to the Hussar? Why don't we see this unit every single game in late game if it's so good? Well, the reason is walls can kind of limit the rating of the Hussar. So if played correctly, if your opponent is playing, thinking outside the box, they can easily stonewall the whole map and make it so your Hussars don't get that rating value, and so they're forced to fight, and maybe the Halberdiers can win in that situation. While that's true, there is a lot of ways to prevent your opponent from fully walling their base, and there's also ways to kill those walls or cut through the trees to make your Hussars able to raid again. And so even in this situation, Hussars can be pretty decent. And also, we do see Hussars in pretty much every single game in high level. Like I would say like 70% of the games I play, at least, I'm going Hussar in late game, and I'm trying to get there if I can. And a lot of other players would probably be saying the same thing as well. It just gives too much value, and the fact that you can raid with it is huge. Also, in super late game where there's no wood and you're really fighting over those last couple wood lines, having no wood attached to your trash unit is so big. Let me explain to you why. A farm without crop rotation, so just heavy plow, has 375 food attached to it. That costs 60 wood for the generic civilization. 60 wood translating to 375 food is a great trade. I'd much rather spend my wood on farms and then use my food on units than spend my wood directly on those units, because I'm not getting that same conversion rate when I'm talking about the farms. So as you can see, wood runs out much faster if you're spending it directly on units than if you're spending it on farms first and then only making Hussar. So having no wood attached to that unit is actually an insane thing, and it makes it clearly the best unit once the wood starts running low. Obviously in this scenario, I didn't take into consideration heavy siege units like onagers and bombard cannons, but even if I did, Hussars are the best unit to kill those siege units. You can easily run in 10 Hussars to snipe a treb, a bombard cannon, or a few onagers, and you don't care if you lose those Hussars, because once again, it'll always be a good trade, because those 80 food cost is so cheap compared to the high gold cost and high wood cost of those siege units. As you can see, in almost every case, the Hussar is simply better. I don't like this unit just because it's fun to play with, but also because it's super effective, and I highly recommend you're playing with it it in almost every single one of your late games. Try to plan to get into it. The only downside of the Hussar is that the upgrade for it is quite expensive, and so it does take a little bit of time to get to it in late game, but once you do, you can easily spam it with its cheap cost and high mobility and get a lot of good value from it. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.